So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Nami Hawk, Senior Vice President with Ipsos Market Strategy and Understanding. Nami, you have the floor.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen, and thanks everyone for joining today. So my name is Nami Hawk. I'm joined by my colleague Lisa Bold, and together we manage what is called Ipsos Essentials, or soon to be rebranded as Ipsos Market Essentials. It's essentially our global behavior and attitude tracker that's been running for the past 5 years. It's a syndicated study, so typically it's meant for subscribers only, but today it's a special event. We hit a special milestone of 100 waves of tracking, which is awesome. So thanks to everyone at Ipsos. There's about a team of 20 that puts this thing together for all the efforts over the years, and thanks to all the subscribers for joining. And thank you all joining for today, whether you're a subscriber or not, because we're going to be sharing some exciting insights, our perspective of how consumers have been adapting and changing pretty much from the pandemic to today. It's called the pandemic to the president. We went from crises of pandemic to now tariffs and all sorts of things that are hitting our hitting consumers and impacting our decisions. So I mentioned we've been tracking since February 2020, and since then we've collected more than 1.2 million responses from citizens in 16 different countries, which is amazing. Today, we're going to be sharing with you insights that are focused on North America. So we'll be looking at data from Canada, from the US. We might sprinkle in a little bit of global data there for context, but that's really the focus. If you join from elsewhere, we do have data for other countries, but today is really going to be focused on the North American story. And so, whether it was the pandemic or whether it was the president, our goal really hasn't changed, and that's to track behaviors and attitudes of consumers during crises and adaptation, understanding how they're adapting to different crises. And so our thesis has been, which brings us to our thesis for today, which is that North Americans have been in near constant state of crisis and adaptation since the pandemic. And that's been having compounding effects on our behaviors. And while consumers have been resilient, cracks are beginning to show. And there's a couple of different metrics that I want to start with just to ground us that really highlight both aspects of this thesis. First, that there's been this constant state of crisis and adaptation. And second, that consumers have been resilient, but that we are seeing cracks in that resiliency. So the first metric I want to talk about is things being out of control. So we asked consumers, do you agree or disagree with the statement, I feel like things in my country are out of control right now? And if we look at the data, it's 3/4 of Americans right now are saying they feel like things in the country are out of control, and 2/3 of Canadians also saying they feel like things in their country are out of control. For context, both of those numbers are higher than the global average of 62%. So North Americans feeling generally like things are out of control, which speaks to that, this compounding effect of crises after crises. The other metric that I wanted to talk about, which touches on the aspect of resiliency, is emotions. So every month, we ask people about how they're feeling right now, and they have an option to choose from 16 different emotions. What you're seeing here is the top 5 emotions across Canada and the US. They're actually the same top 5, slightly different order. But what we can see is that while there is frustration and there is skepticism, some of those top emotions really show that humans have been resilient. Like calm is number 1. Optimistic is in the top 5. Sensible is in the top 5. And what you're seeing here is a change in emotions from 2020 to 2025. Now, when we look at emotions and we ask people, how they're feeling, that doesn't tend to change a lot. So even when we see, 3%, 4%, 5% changes in emotions at a global level or at a national level, those are big changes. So what we've seen since the pandemic, from September 2020 to 2025, people are feeling a little less frustrated. That's great. We're also feeling a little bit more calm. We're feeling a little bit less sensible, I guess, which I read as maybe a little bit more carefree, right? You required a lot of sort of sensibility and sort of regimen and routine during the pandemic, and people are feeling a little, well, maybe less sensible, or it could be a bad thing. You know, we don't necessarily know all the whys behind it, but maybe a little bit of both. Skepticism is roughly the same, but the one to keep a track on as well is optimism. So people are feeling a little bit less optimistic than they used to. So these are the top 5, and roughly, you know, like I said, they haven't really changed at all since the pandemic, and they're the same across Canada and the US. If we go a click down though, and we look at some of the places where we have seen the biggest changes, it really starts to get interesting. What we've mapped here for you is not the top emotions, but the ones that have changed the most. So we see the biggest shifts in these emotions, and it's actually similar in Canada and the US in terms of the overall picture, in terms of what's changed. So what are the biggest changes in people's emotions over the last 5 years? People are less bored and lonely. That's great. And it makes sense because we've come out of the pandemic where we had lockdowns and we couldn't socialize, and you know, at the time there was a lot of boredom, people were isolated, they were feeling lonely, and so that's improved, which is great. The other thing we're seeing is we're feeling more empowered, more excited. So people are getting out more. They're empowered to make decisions. There's not as many regulations. They're excited about things, which is great. People are, they're traveling more. They're doing activities. They're doing things that they were unable to do during the pandemic. But we're also seeing, some cracks. This is what we're talking about. There was an increase in people feeling pessimistic or a sort of decline in optimism. We're also seeing more people feel defeated. So again, that's that sort of crises after crises, and it's sort of wearing people down. So people are feeling more defeated, and interestingly, people are feeling less well prepared for what's to come. So again, there is this sense that people have been resilient. We're feeling generally good and calm and sensible, but empowerment's up, excitement's up, but we're also seeing that people are feeling defeated and less prepared than they were before. So that's at a high level. We want to click down into some things that we're going to talk about today that really, they all fit within that theme of crisis and adaptation and sort of resilience and maybe some cracks. But the 3 areas we're going to focus on today are, first of all, the impact of the pandemic. What impact has that had on us? And what we find is that the pandemic created a lasting impact, but the changes were modest. We adapted with resilience and rather than sort of radical transformation. The second area we want to look at is what was the impact of inflation and increasingly tariffs? What impact has that had on brands and retailers and shopping? What we found is the impact of inflation and more recently tariffs on shopping are as profound as those experienced during the pandemic. And it's impacting both brand and retailer choice. And then this final section is sort of, if we get past, some of the big issues around, initially the pandemic and then inflation and the economy, what are some of the other things that people are worried about that are leading to what we're calling a polycrisis? So citizens shift in focus from a singular global crisis to a multifaceted polycrisis, and that's leaving many people feeling overwhelmed and pessimistic about the future. So we're going to go through each one. The first one is really about this lasting impact of the pandemic, and there's a number of things that we've seen change. So we're going to go through some of those changes and talk a little bit about them. I'm going to start off with a global view. So this is just at a really high level. The pandemic brought about a number of different changes, and we went back to some of the data from 2020 and asked people about their predictions for how the world was going to change. And again, we're going to global numbers here just for some context. But back in June of 2020, 70% of people felt like there was going to be this global recession. At the time, it was more about businesses are getting shut down. sort of demand is down, productivity is down, and people felt like that was driving a recession. There really wasn't much of a thought to inflation or tariffs at the time. But if you look at now, I'm not saying, it's, for sure in a recession, but if you look at some of the data, 71% of citizens feel like they are at moderate or higher risk due to inflation and rising prices. And financially, we know people are stressed. A lot of people even now feeling like, if it's not already a recession, we're gonna be having a recession. So that was kind of a prediction that unfortunately did come true. Another prediction back in June 2020, 61% of people felt like we'd be working from home. That'd be the new normal. We'll give that one a check mark too. Maybe a little bit early to call. I know a lot of places are bringing people back to office. Some of those back to office mandates have increased, but over half right now of those employed currently are saying that they work from home at least some time. So at least 1 day a week have the opportunity to work from home with an average of 3.5 days per week. Another prediction that we made back in 2020, people felt like travel will be closer to home. People will be avoiding international trips. That one turned out to be not so true. So travel was one of the first things that people that sort of came back. So it was one of the first things that people started to do as restrictions opened up. And if you look at the data today, almost half of people traveled outside their hometown or city in the past 4 weeks, and 18% are planning international trips. So travel did come back. The last prediction we'll look at around masks. There was a lot of sort of talk around masks. We started doing this tracking. 77% of people said that they'll be required to wear masks when flying. If we look at that number, it's not even close. So last time people were traveling, only 5% said that they wore masks. So a lot of predictions. Some of them came true, some of them didn't. It's been a while since the pandemic ended, and so hindsight's 2020. We can look back and say, look, oh, how smart we were, how silly we were. But if we go back in time just a little bit to right before the pandemic ended, so we can look at how people were feeling. This was data from September 2022. So the pandemic officially ended in May 2023, but by 2022 September, the end was in sight, and many felt like the change had been significant. So this is about 2.5 years into the pandemic. We were asking people to reflect on the impact and the changes that it had on their habits and routines. At the time, the data here is people who said that they adopted significantly different habits and routines, or somewhat different habits and routines, and you can look at the net. And the biggest places were around travel. Obviously, all the restrictions. People felt like their work life was changed. It's amongst people who are employed. Their social lives have been changed. How they shop, their health and wellness, what they do for fun, daily travel and commute, all the way down to their faith and spirituality. 44% said their habits and routines were different around their faith. So really fundamental, deep changes that we were seeing. And again, this is at a global level. But then we bounced back. And so for the rest of this section that I'm going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at how people bounce back, or some of the things that didn't bounce back. And really, again, the first thing to bounce back, like I mentioned, was travel. So let's have a look at travel. So compared to July 2020, these are travel numbers for past 4 weeks, traveling by air within my country, traveling by air to another country. Really, really low numbers, 2%, 3%, 5%. The yellow is the global numbers. You can see Canada and the US traveling a little bit more now. So if you look at September 2025, those numbers are sort of back to where they were pre-pandemic, and in some cases even higher. Now, some of the where people are traveling and how people are traveling has changed, but the fact is travel is back. Which is great. One of the things about travel, and we noticed this not in travel, but in a lot of aspects of the pandemic recovery, is that it wasn't equal. So there's a term people started using around the K-shaped recovery, the fact that there was this divide between haves and have-nots coming out of the pandemic. And travel was one of the first places we began to see that, where, if you had the money, if you could afford it, if you were sort of in a better position, you were doing more things, and if you didn't, you were sort of taking a negative turn. So we can look at some of this data. This is, again, global, broken down by income. So if you look at travel, most restrictions were ended towards the end of 2022. So you look at 2023, and if you're a higher income individual, you were traveling a lot more. If you were medium or a low income individual, that line dipped and sort of continued to dip for lower income individuals. If you look at Canada, it's much of the same story, maybe more of a squeeze on sort of middle income Canadians or middle class Canadians that really were feeling the pinch as inflation went off. And then if you look at sort of amongst lower income, just really sort of a sharp decline from 2021 to 2025 in terms of people that were traveling or could travel. If you look at the US, again, sort of a similar story, less of a growth in travel, but you can see the tiers there. And if you look at sort of higher income, medium income, it remains stable. But if you look at that low income line, it really dipped and sank. So travel was one thing we missed that came back. But again, it wasn't sort of equally afforded. We can look at a few other examples here as well. So this is around social activities. So the pandemic, everyone is feeling pretty lonely. People are craving social interaction. So this is two different questions. The light purple is 2020, people missed doing certain activities. And then 2025, what are people currently doing? So don't necessarily focus on the differences between the bars because for some activities like dining and socializing with friends, you'll see that those are above what the percentage of people that missed it. For other activities like going to a concert or a live sporting event, not as many people are doing that as missed it. But again, this is about the past month, so you're not going to be going to a concert or a sporting event every month, so those numbers are going to be lower. But generally, most things came back, right? People started going out again. They went to bars, they went to concerts, they went to sporting events, they were socializing. The only one that maybe is a little bit lower than we were anticipating is going to a movie theater. But again, people have streaming, they have bigger TVs in their home. Maybe there's still this perception of movie theaters being a place that people don't want to go to. So that's the one that was a little bit lower. And then if we look at sort of this is North American numbers, the ones on the right are really driven more by the US than by Canada. So I mentioned, we're showing North American data here, Canada, US. Just a little bit of a key as you're looking at some of the data on the slides. If it's red, it's Canada. If it's blue, it's the US. If it's purple, red and blue together, that's North American data. So North American data, but we'll call out differences. And in this case, a lot of that socializing was driven more by the US. Another major area we wanted to look at was around health and wellness. So the pandemic really changed our perception of health and wellness. The risk related to health and wellness hasn't changed much. So if you look at North America, about 55% of people feel like their overall health and well-being is at risk. And that's been relatively consistent. The one thing that did change though is during the pandemic, we were really focused on immunity and not getting sick and staying healthy and wearing masks and not getting COVID and not getting sick. That's really changed to more of a focus on holistic wellness. So mental health became more important, and just general well-being became more important. So if we look at some of the other numbers, close to 90% of North Americans feel like managing mental health is as important as physical health. And a lot of that came out of the loneliness and sort of that the people were feeling during the pandemic. It became a lot more important. And 30% say mental health is their top health concern. So we ask people to rank health concerns. It can be anything from mental health and fatigue down to cardiovascular health or dental health, oral health. And the top one amongst all age groups, actually except for boomers, is mental health, with 30% of people saying that that's the most important. Another trend that we focused on during the pandemic was buying local. So if we think back to the pandemic, buying local was really a way to support small businesses. People felt like main streets were closing down. That behavior continues today, although the motivations have changed a little bit. So if we look back at August 2020 and March 2021, when we had data points, people said that when shopping, they tried to buy domestic products rather than foreign-made ones. People said that when shopping, it was important to buy from local stores and businesses. If you fast forward to today, those numbers are largely the same. So 72% when shopping, I try to buy domestic rather than foreign-made. 73% when shopping, it's important for me to buy from local stores and businesses. The numbers for Canada are higher, which speaks to a little bit of the shift in motivation for some of these numbers. So the 69% when shopping, I try to avoid American products is tied to tariffs. And Lisa's going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to the shopping section. But there's still this focus on buying local, but now it's sort of as much driven by tariffs and sort of threats of tariffs as it is by wanting to support local businesses, which is interesting. So we can see again, before it was all about supporting businesses during the pandemic. More recently, and if you're in Canada watching this, you've heard elbows up, this idea that we're going to be on the defensive, and part of that is buying local and staying sort of Canadian. Digital behaviors was another thing we saw shift during the pandemic. So if we look at some of the digital behaviors that really took hold during the pandemic, communicating with family and friends via video, communicating with coworkers via video, streaming services that really exploded during the pandemic, as well as delivery. So whether it's food delivery or grocery delivery, by and large, a lot of those behaviors have stuck around. So that's something that we did see digital acceleration during the pandemic, and that is continuing today. So streaming services, even more so now than it was in 2020. Video communications, whether for work or for business, a little bit down, but still really strong numbers. And then that food delivery and restaurant, grocery delivery, those numbers maintain, and particularly in the US, where we see a lot more people saying that they're using food delivery services or grocery delivery services than we saw in Canada. And then if we sort of double click on that last point, really around the work and the shift in work and video calls, it really speaks to the digital acceleration that solidified remote work, right? We talked about more than half of both Americans and Canadians are working from home at least one day a week. A lot of people said that, well, that was going to lead to a loss of culture or a loss of connections with coworkers. And what we find is that one of the reasons that remote work has stuck around is because the metrics and the performance of people that are working remotely have maintained and are just as strong. So if we look at some of these metrics, I have flexibility in how I work in my job when we compare those who work from home versus those who work in an office only. Obviously, people who work from home feel that they have more flexibility, but they also are more likely to say that they feel supported by their employer. They're more likely to say that their current work situation allows them productivity to be productive at their jobs. And in terms of feeling connected to their colleagues and coworkers, in the US, it's roughly the same. In Canada, people who are going into the office feel a little bit more connected to their colleagues and coworkers, but still 2/3 of those that work from home are saying that they feel connected. So there was this shift to remote work. And again, jury's out. More people may get called back to the office, but for now we're seeing sort of strong support and strong evidence for remote work as well. And then the last shift, really not really a pandemic shift, but has happened since the pandemic, is really the boom in AI. And so if we look at the use of AI, it's about half of both Americans and Canadians are using AI either for personal or work. Personal use is much higher, which is actually a crazy number if you think about it. Upwards of 8 in 10 North Americans saying that they're using AI tools that didn't even exist 5 years ago for personal use, and then for business use, it's close to half. And if we look at attitudes towards AI, people are saying, it's sort of mixed, right? People are saying that it's going to help improve efficiency and lead to new opportunities for growth. A lot of people also feel like it could be dangerous and we should approach it with caution. About half say it'll profoundly change how they do their jobs in the next 5 years, and slightly less say that they trust companies using AI. we look at the numbers across North America, we can see that Americans tend to be a little bit more positive than Canadians, but both are less positive than the global numbers. So attitudes towards AI globally, 64% are saying that AI will help improve efficiency and lead to new opportunities for growth. A lot of that's driven by Asian countries, which tend to be higher in terms of the positive attitudes towards AI, as well as adoption. So, I mean, it's been kind of fun to look back at some of the changes in our lives. You know, when we were putting this Essentials report together, or this presentation together, we definitely were sort of reminiscing and going down memory lane. And you can see there's some things, you know, changed quite dramatically, other things didn't change quite as much. When we look at it overall, though, and again, this is sort of, you know, hindsight's 2020, but if we go back to July 2020, and when we ask people, you know, how much change do you think the pandemic will have? More people felt like it was going to be a dramatic change compared to today when we look at how much change we actually experience. So this is a scale from no change to everything will be changing. So on the far left, you know, I will do everything exactly the same as I did before the pandemic, and on the right, my life will completely changed or has completely changed as a result of the pandemic. We can see, you know, predictions back in 2020 were more towards the everything will change side. And if we come back today and when we ask people in September 2025, more people are saying, you know, I do most things exactly the same as I did before the pandemic, or, you know, I made small changes, but most things are the way they were. So again, sort of speaking to that aspect of resiliency. The pandemic ultimately resulted in, I think, fewer long-term behavior changes than we initially expected. And many disruptions were really absorbed by citizens and consumers. If we look at that across the world, we see that Canada and the US are kind of middle of the pack, right? So some places saw more dramatic change. Again, the sort of red and orange bars are more dramatic change. So India, South Africa, Mexico, saying that things changed much more because of the pandemic, whereas some countries on the right-hand side, Spain, Germany, South Korea, Japan, France, sort of Europe, Asian countries are saying they saw less dramatic change as a result of the pandemic. Okay, so we talked a lot about shifts in human behavior, attitudes, you know, around health and wellness, AI, work, travel. One of the things we didn't touch on yet is shopping, and I know that's a major one for a lot of people on the call today. We've got a lot of marketers in the room. So I'm going to pass it over to Lisa. Talk a little bit more about how shopping has changed and what the impact has been since the pandemic to now. So Lisa, over to you.
Thank you. So as we moved on from the hurdles of COVID, we pretty much walked straight into a new global headache that many of us saw coming, and that was the widespread struggles of inflation and rising costs. So each month since 2020, we've been asking people about what's worrying them the most. So we added some concerns along the way, such as conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine, but as you can see on the chart that's coming up, we didn't really get a break. So as COVID concerns eased in late 2021, economic worries really took the spotlight, and inflation has been the top concern for quite a while now. And it stands out as the biggest worry by some margin. And many people agree that, you know, they think governments should be boosting the economy, focusing on the economy, even if it means putting other issues like the environment or climate change on the back burner for now, and that's a view that's shared by even the most environmentally conscious consumers as well. So during the summer of 2020, we asked consumers about how much the pandemic had changed the way they shopped, and we saw that there'd been, you know, quite a substantial shift. So more than a quarter of US shoppers and a fifth in Canada reported experiencing drastic changes. And for Wave 100 in September, we asked a similar question to see how much inflation had changed shopping behavior. And inflation is impacting shopping habits just as much as the pandemic, but albeit in a distinctly different way, which we're going to take a look at now. So if we reflect back on how we were shopping during the pandemic, we were wearing masks, we were standing 6 feet apart in stores on designated floor dots, and we were sanitizing at every opportunity. And these are routines that are now largely outdated, and we should all be very thankful that the pool noodle headgear did not catch on as a fashion statement. But some things did stick, and some things have persisted beyond the pandemic. And that's things such as limiting the time we spend in stores, the popularity of buy online and pick up in store, and that's particularly true in the US. And these are lasting changes that are highlighting the shift in consumer preferences towards, greater convenience and efficiency when we're shopping. And over the last few years, we've faced, quite the lineup of shopping challenges. If you remember, empty shelves, the never-ending checkout lines, the awkwardness of social distancing. But one thing that is sticking around, even as the world moves past COVID, and that is prices being higher than we expect them to be. So although COVID's influence on pricing is a thing of the past, economic volatility has definitely filled its shoes. So today, more than 3/4 of North Americans, they say they're being extra careful, more conscious of their purchases due to rising costs. And more than 80% are employing tactics such as hunting for coupons or price matching, or even just delaying purchases that can wait. And even though a lot of people say they've gotten used to the higher prices, it's clear they're still taking a hard look at where every dollar goes. We're rethinking which brands we're buying, and we're rethinking where we're buying them from to make every cent count. So in a typical 2-week period, about a third of Canadians likely to choose a different retailer in search of better deals. It's a bit less in the States, but still 1 in 4 Americans doing the same thing. And when it comes to brands, our loyalty has definitely been challenged. So 21% of Americans, 24% of Canadians, they're ready to switch to another brand for savings, and even more are opting for generic or store brands instead. And buying generic or store brands is something we're seeing more from North American shoppers. They're saying they're doing those more than we hear from Asian countries in the study. So, but despite all this, despite the rising prices, shoppers are also navigating, this increased focus on health and well-being that Naomi touched on earlier. And so even as budgets tighten, we're still mindful of how we're spending, how those choices can impact our wellness. 3/4 of North Americans report actively managing their health and wellness through their purchasing decisions. More than half are willing to pay a premium for locally grown produce, and they're generally seeking high quality products during the grocery trips. And no category is safe from switching behaviour. So across both Canada and the US, consumers looking for ways to save, especially on weekly expenses like food, grocery, where both retailer and brand switching are occurring equally. So in today's world, brands and retailers, they're battling it out with everyday household expenses for a slice of budgets. So many North Americans are actually pretty worried about how they'll pay their next month's bills, and some even have to tap into their savings to do that. But on top of that, only about half are actually managing to save right now, and 1/4 are just getting by paycheck to paycheck. So, and the bigger ticket purchases, they feel the hit. They're increasingly being delayed or even cancelled. But as we wrapped up 2024, we did start to see some evidence of people feeling a bit more hopeful. Half of North Americans told us in January that over the past year, they'd been able to spend more time socializing, they'd done a better job at staying in contact with family and friends, they'd been able to focus more on their health and wellness, and they'd learned to manage their finances better too. But then 2025 threw us some curveballs with tariff scares and American boycotts, and consumers in Canada, the US and Mexico were all feeling it. And that anxiety has dipped a bit since March when we started tracking the risk. But more than half are still feeling that threat today. And for comparison, 45% are feeling at risk over in Europe and just 24% in China. So while citizens in all 3 countries are worried, we're seeing the biggest impact on Canadian shopping behaviours. So following the tariff threats, Canada in particular saw a big jump in consumers prioritizing domestic products over foreign made when they're shopping, and that trend continues to hold strong. And it's more than a response to rising prices and economic policy. Canadians feel pretty hurt. They're feeling a bit betrayed by their closest ally in the US, and so there's a big movement to become self-sufficient and not rely as much on the US as we have done. So in fact, 6 in 10 Canadians agree with the statement, we can never trust the US the same way again. And there's been a big push to buy domestic and be more economically independent. And the categories most impacted here are food and grocery as well as travel. And just at global level, it's older generations that are more likely than younger generations to be focusing more on buying domestic products. So right now, currently 44% of shoppers globally continue to avoid American products when they're shopping. The trend is obviously more pronounced in Canada, where 70% of consumers are trying to choose alternatives to American brands. And as we've said, it's not just about price tags. So our ethnography participant, Shaheen, she points out that it's also about making purchases that align with her social values, what we think is the right thing to do. So in this section, we've kind of covered, how COVID significantly reshaped our shopping habits and how now we're seeing inflation make its mark in different but equally impactful ways. But the landscape we're navigating today is not just defined by economic challenges and threats of tariffs. So I know we mentioned earlier, we're unlike the more singular focus of the pandemic, we've now got a whole bunch of global worries that are capturing our attention simultaneously. And I'm going to hand back to Naomi for more on how that's impacting us now as well.
Thanks, Lisa. So like Lisa was saying, we no longer have the luxury, if you want to call it that, of just focusing on one issue. We've shifted from a singular global crisis to a multifaceted polycrisis, the term we like to use, and that's leaving many people feeling overwhelmed and pessimistic about the future. So let's start by looking at the number of risks that people might feel impacted by. In our study, we ask about 5 sort of macro risks. We ask about rising prices and inflation, which is clearly the biggest one, so more people feel at risk because of that than any other risk. We ask about risk to overall health and well-being, sort of between 50 and 60% of North Americans feeling at risk, political and social unrest, US economic policy and tariffs, and natural disasters and major climate events. And you can see that if you look at the differences between Canadians and Americans, Canadians are a little bit more likely to say rising prices and inflation is the thing that is causing them personal risk, whereas Americans, it's the other 4, health and well-being, political and social unrest, US economic policy and natural disasters, and climate events. And then the numbers on the left, the 58%, actually the same in both countries, are saying they feel personally at risk from at least 4 out of the 5 of the macro risks that we ask about. Some additional data points, women are more likely to feel personally at risk from 4+ macro risks, and that's a little bit more in Canada than in the US. And if you think about balancing some of these, natural disasters and major climate events has sort of fallen. It's sort of the last or the least likely to be cited as a personal risk by both Canadians and Americans. And that's been declining a little bit in terms of priority over the past 4 years. So now 7 in 10 of both Americans and Canadians feel the environment and climate have been deprioritized because of other concerns. And 6 in 10 agree with the statement that the government should focus on helping the economy first and foremost, even if it means taking actions that could be negative or have a negative impact on the environment and climate. So people really prioritizing the economy, although it is still there, it's still cited as one of the major risks. So if you're looking at the 58%, it's not everybody that's facing a polycrisis, but it's a good chunk, right? 6 out of 10 are saying 4 or 5 of these major risks are personally impacting me. And if you are one of those among that 58% that feel at risk due to 4 or more risks, it has an impact on all aspects. So one of the things that we noticed during the pandemic was that financial well-being and emotional well-being and physical well-being are all connected, right? So if you're more likely to feel at risk due to rising prices and inflation, you also tend to be more at risk due to health and well-being. So those tend to be connected. If you are among that 58% that feel personally at risk from at least 4 out of the 5 macro risks, you're twice as likely to feel frustrated. So 42% feeling frustrated versus 21%. You're twice as likely to feel scared. So again, 31% versus 14% feeling scared. So it's having a negative impact on your emotional state as well. And then if you think of that sort of compounding effect, like I was saying, you know, financial well-being tied to emotional and physical health. If you're in a household with kids, you're more likely to feel financially squeezed and feel at risk due to your health and well-being. And as you'd expect, lower income households are also more likely to be hit by multiple risks. So as you might imagine, with so many things going on in the world, you know, again, it seemed like a luxury when it was just one focus and everyone could sort of, you know, get on board with dealing with COVID. The emergence of all the different risks, so not really emergence, these were always there, it just are, you know, they sort of came back to the fore as the pandemic ended, has left us feeling really overwhelmed and out of control. So if you look at some of those attitudes, 2/3 of North Americans say there's so many critical problems in the world that they struggle with what to focus on, and a similar proportion saying they feel powerless when it comes to the big problems facing the world. Younger people are disproportionately impacted. So quote there from Canadian Gen Xer, there's so many things that are happening, and you know, looking at the younger generation and seeing all the things that they've had to live through is insane. Is sort of empathizing with the Gen Z and the millennial cohorts that are feeling perhaps even more overwhelmed. So going back to the opening metric about how people are feeling like things in their country are out of control, it's an interesting one to track over time, and I did want to come back to that because it shows really if you sort of track it over time, it shows the impact that various events have had on our well-being and on our mental state as citizens. So this is, I feel like things in my country are out of control, and we're tracking it all the way back to when we first asked it in July of 2020 to when we most recently asked it in September 2025. If you look at the global line, it's actually increased. So globally, more people now feel like things are out of control than they did in the heart of the pandemic. If you look at the Canada line, it's a little bit more dramatic. It's sort of up and down, and it mirrors a lot of with what's happening in the US as well. So there's the US line, Americans more likely to feel like things are out of control than Canadians right now. And if you overlay sort of what was happening at the time, you know, when we started tracking, it was right when we were having major protests in the US around Black Lives Matter. There was sort of all sorts of strife and turmoil related to that. That sort of came down a little bit, but then we had a second wave of COVID and everything sort of spiked again. We had a third wave, the sort of alpha variant, if you remember the variant names back in the day. And then vaccines came and it was great, right? All those, you know, everyone was feeling like things were more in control. That line dips for both Canada and the US. And then there was another wave. The Omicron came around, and right around that same time, there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that was sparking a lot of uncertainty. And then it was sort of a slow climb, right? From sort of March 2022 to April 2023, it was this slow increase, and that was just inflation grinding away at people, right? People were noticing everything was more expensive. Life is harder. I can't afford the things that I want to afford. And more people were feeling like things were out of control. There was a bump there around the start of the conflict with Israel and Gaza. There was another bump there during the assassination attempt on President Trump. And then there was a little bit of a flip there. So, you know, Canadians were for a sec feeling like things were more out of control than Americans when President Trump announced the tariffs back in sort of February. And then that flipped back again. Again, Lisa was talking a little bit about sort of the emotion behind that, but really interesting to see the shift in emotions sort of from 2020 to now, and looking at some of the things that had major impact on that. If we look at that globally, you can see that in some countries, really more citizens now are feeling like things are out of control. So particularly France, Germany, Italy, Canada, big jumps. And in Canada in particular, since this is the North American webinar, the things that are stressing Canadians out the most are around political unrest and leadership, right? So we've got a new prime minister. We're just still trying to figure out how he's doing, as well as news and social media events. So there's a lot of, whether it's Canadian news, international news, making Canadians feel uneasy. In the US, it's down a little bit, but still relatively on the high end compared to other countries. And then in some countries you've seen, we see it go down a bit, but generally, like we said, on a global level, it's increased. So more people globally feeling like things are out of control than not. If we look at that, just double clicking on the US, it does matter, if you're a sort of Democrat or Republican right now. Democrats more likely to feel like things are out of control than Republicans. Makes sense, particularly since the election. And what this has left us with is generally feeling pessimistic about the future. So if we look to the future, we're not overly optimistic. We asked respondents on a number of different metrics. Are you more likely to feel optimistic right now about the future or pessimistic when it comes to the economy? More people feeling pessimistic. The environment, more people feeling pessimistic. Education, healthcare, the same story. If you look at the green bars, Americans are feeling a little bit more optimistic, or more Americans are likely to feel optimistic than Canadians are right now, particularly around the economy. And again, we said, risk due to inflation was much higher in Canada. And the environment, I think we're both Americans and Canadians roughly on the same page when it comes to education. And healthcare, interestingly, even though Canadian, or maybe because of Canadians' public healthcare, more Canadians are pessimistic about healthcare in the future than in the US. And we touched on AI, sort of the new technology that's emerging. People are adopting it. There is a sense that's going to help solve a lot of the world's problems as well. But again, less than half of both Canadians and Americans are feeling optimistic that artificial intelligence will help solve a lot of these problems that we're seeing. So we can't rely entirely on AI to solve it. There is something for us, as brands, as retailers, to step in and act as well. So where does that leave us as marketers, as senior leaders in organizations? As representatives of brands and retailers, we can be perhaps doing more, acting with empathy and leaning in to help. If you look at some of these perceptions of brands and retailers amongst consumers, the numbers have not been great. So we're asking Canadians in this slide, how good or poor of a job do you think each of the following are doing to help improve your personal financial situation? We asked about brands and manufacturers. You can see this is a top two box, doing good or very good. Only 24% of Canadians saying brands and manufacturers are doing a good job. Higher in the US, but still room for improvement. When it comes to stores and retailers, similarly, 25% of Canadians saying stores and retailers are doing a good job, 45% of Americans. For context, the global numbers are around 40% for both of those numbers. We ask a similar question as it relates to health and well-being. Are brands and retailers, stores and manufacturers, stores and retailers and brands and manufacturers doing a good job or not? And the numbers are similar, right? Not great scores in terms of brands and manufacturers doing a good job, not great scores in terms of stores and retailers doing a good job. So what can we be doing to help? We'd like to leave you with a few thought starters. There's obviously a lot more, and this discussion could continue for quite some time. But just at a high level, some things to think about, as we're reviewing the data, as we're thinking about that sort of constant state of crisis and adaptation, resilience and perhaps cracks around that resilience. What can we as brands and retailers be doing? First thing, act with empathy. I think that's something everyone can relate to, and we already kind of know that. I don't really need to say it, but it's a tough time for North Americans, Canadians, Americans. We can see they're struggling. The more empathetic we can be as brands, the better. There is this rise of what we're calling the price first consumer, right? So people are, like Lisa was talking about, really focused on value right now. We know in Canada, certainly retailers are opening more sort of hard discount stores. In the US, there's a huge focus on price guarantees, and so we're seeing that become more important. There's still a space for quality, despite all this, particularly in the food space and the grocery space. We still have consumers saying that, I'm still prioritizing buying quality food, or if I have extra money to spend, I'm going to spend it on food because that's important to me and it's tied to wellness. But everything within the context of value. Support for health and well-being, particularly holistic health. So there's obviously, if you're in the food space or the sort of exercise space, the wellness space, there's certainly things you can be doing. But even brands in other categories, focusing on mental health. Or messaging around mental health, or thinking about, how can this tie into giving someone a break in their day or allowing them to refocus. All of that type of messaging really resonating right now. Focus on local. That never went away. It was popular before the pandemic. It was popular during the pandemic. It's popular now. The motivations, again, have changed. So if you're in Canada, we're doing a lot of work right now around Buy Canadian and the risks of sort of maple washing, as you might call it. If you're in the US, similar focus. Maybe not as strong right now because there's not that same sort of anti-American sentiment, but still this focus on local. And that was the whole point of the tariffs in the first place, was to reignite that domestic trade and buying local. And then finally, ESG is a co-benefit. So talk really briefly about ESG. There's lots more to say on it. But right now, it's not a time to abandon ESG and climate environment, but really we have to sell it as a co-benefit, because leading with it is not going to be as strong as it once was. Again, there's a bit of seasonality to that. So in the summer months, when we have wildfires and heat waves, people tend to think a little bit more about it. So you might get away with a little bit more of that sort of environmental messaging. But again, it's really tough to lead with that right now. We have to lead with sort of what are the other things that this is going to help. And again, going back to point number 3, tying it to health and wellness, often associated with ESG as well. So that might be the angle more so than, hey, because it's good for the climate or it's good for the environment or it's good for society. So we'll leave it there. I know there's opportunity to leave questions in the chat. I don't know if any questions have been coming through. I think, Lisa, you've been monitoring.
We have a few, yeah. So we'll address a couple now, but obviously we can follow up individually for any that we don't get to. So the first one really builds on the last point you just made there. So like ESG topics, they've been a big conversation starter over recent years, but it seems like the buzz has quieted down a bit. Do we still see any consumer groups that are still particularly focused on these issues?
Yeah, I mean, consumer groups, we get asked a lot. So we actually, sometimes there's a myth that, oh, well, it's young people that are going to focus more on ESG issues, and that's not entirely true. We actually did a segmentation which lives within Essentials too. So if you're subscribing, you've probably seen it. We have different groups, and it's actually a bit of a misnomer that your activists are all young people. First of all, activists are consumers of all ages. But second of all, there's also a misnomer that activists are the best people to go after because they tend to care the most about the environment. There's another group actually that is young professionals who care about the environment but live busy lives. A lot of them, they sort of over-index on millennials. They over-index on caring about social issues. And it's a really good group right now to target because they're the group that they feel guilty about their impact on the environment. They feel guilty that they can't spend more on social causes. And they're willing to invest in brands that do that so that they can sort of, they can tick off their ESG boxes by investing in brands or making purchasing decisions that support the environment or support social issues, even more so than activists, which sometimes, they care the most, but they don't always have the same spending power. So yeah, it's this group we call Discerning Realists. We have more about it in a segmentation that we can share if people are interested.
Cool.
Good question.
Okay, one more. So given the current global challenges, how are Gen Z adapting and navigating these crises? Are there any particular strategies or attitudes that seem unique to this generation compared to others?
Yeah, how are they faring? Not great. Gen Z is universally across all countries that we track faring worse than other generations, particularly when it comes to things like mental health, ability to sort of save and spend. I mean, all generations are squeezed in different ways, but younger generations, sort of millennials, are squeezed because they have families and kids and mortgages. And so they're starting to enter that sandwich generation where they also have, sort of aging parents. And so millennials are squeezed in a different way. But when you think about Gen Z, they're more likely to feel lonely. They're more likely to have mental health issues. They're more likely to be financially unstable. And so there's a lot of, I think, all the metrics that we talked about in terms of, brands and retailers, helping out with people's financial situation or helping out with their health and wellness. I think that's even more important for Gen Zs right now. So at a high level, I mean, there's obviously more nuance at a category level, but yeah, I think Gen Z is struggling for sure. I don't know, we have time. I know we're at time.
Yeah.
I think maybe given it's 2, we will stop there. I know we are collecting questions, so we will get back to all your questions via email. And just quickly, we're at wave 100. We're not going to stop at wave 100. We just actually got out of field with wave 101. So there's lots more insights and a lot more sort of tracking across topics that we can help out with. If you're interested in learning more about it, shoot us a quick email. It's there, essentials@ipsos.com. And with that, I'll turn it back to Ellen just to quickly wrap up.
Thank you so much, Nami and Lisa, for today's really insightful deep dive. Really appreciated that. And thank you everyone for joining us. We did get a few questions and we will be responding to you directly via email. Also on the lookout in your email box will be a direct link to today's recorded presentation. However, that won't come for a day or 2. In the meantime, we do welcome the opportunity to speak with you, and Nami does have an email address there to reach out to us, so please don't hesitate. That now concludes today's amazing webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.